The Japanese military doctrine they called Gyokusai, which meant shattering like a jewel, had evolved over the course of the war from something that might have been considered tactical maneuver into what was really strategic delusion by the time 1944 rolled around. What had started out as shock tactics used in China against forces that were poorly equipped and poorly coordinated had hardened into something like religious doctrine by the time the Japanese were facing an enemy that had industrialized warfare in ways they seemed unable to comprehend. The first warnings that something was wrong with this approach had come back at Guadalcanal in August of 1942, when the Ichiki Detachment, 917 men from the 28th Infantry Regiment, had charged right into Marine positions along what the Americans had started calling Alligator Creek. The Marines, who were supported by pre-registered artillery from the 11th Marines Regiment, killed more than 800 of those Japanese soldiers in a single night of fighting. The few survivors who made it back to Japanese lines reported something they'd never encountered before, something unprecedented in their experience. American shells had arrived simultaneously from multiple directions, they said, creating what amounted to a wall of steel that no amount of courage could penetrate, no amount of willingness to die could overcome. By the time the Americans landed at Tarawa in November of 1943, they had refined their system even further. Fire Direction Centers, which everyone just called FDCS, were now using improved radio communications and standardized procedures that could mass fires from multiple battalions in under 2 minutes. The Japanese charges that had succeeded through psychological impact back in China, back when they were fighting Chinese forces that didn't have the coordination or equipment to respond effectively, were being systematically destroyed by mathematical precision. The disparity between American and Japanese artillery doctrine represented more than just a technological difference, more than just having better equipment or more shells to fire. It was a chasm between industrial might and warrior mythology, between a way of fighting that relied on systems and coordination and a way of fighting that relied on spirit and willingness to sacrifice. While Japanese artillery units still relied on direct observation and individual battery fire, with each battery essentially operating on its own without much coordination with other batteries, the Americans had created an integrated system that would become the model for how modern artillery operated. The American Fire Direction Center that had been perfected by 1944 was really a marvel of applied mathematics when you think about it. Artillery officers used graphical firing tables and slide rules and plotting boards to calculate firing solutions that took into account air temperature and wind speed and barrel wear and powder temperature, and even the rotation of the earth itself, all of these factors that affected where a shell would land. A trained FDC crew could compute a fire mission for multiple batteries in under 60 seconds, getting all the data calculated and transmitted before a full minute had passed. Major David Little, who commanded the 3rd Battalion of the 10th Marines on Saipan, described the system in his official reports that were filed after the battle. He wrote that they had forward observers with every infantry company, connected by radio and wire back to the FDC. When those observers called for fire, the FDC crew plotted the target on their firing chart, calculated the data for each battery based on where that battery was positioned, and transmitted the firing commands. Within 90 seconds of the initial call, rounds were in the air from multiple batteries, all of them timed to impact simultaneously on the target. The Japanese had nothing even remotely comparable to this system. Their artillery doctrine, which was based on French methods from the First World War, emphasized direct fire and individual battery action. Communication between units relied on runners physically carrying messages and signal flags being waved from position to position. Their forward observers, when they even had forward observers at all, didn't have radios to call back with. A Japanese artillery battery might take 15 minutes or more to engage a target that American gunners could hit in under 2 minutes. By the time the 6th of July arrived in 1944, the Japanese situation on Saipan had become completely hopeless, though they refused to acknowledge it as such. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito's forces had been pushed back into a pocket in the northern part of the island, compressed into an area that was barely 3 miles wide from one side to the other. Of the original 32,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors who had been on the island when the Americans landed, fewer than 5,000 remained what anyone could call combat effective. American forces, specifically the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, along with elements of the Army's 27th Infantry Division, had them surrounded on 3 sides with the ocean at their backs on the 4th. In his final order, which was discovered on his body after the battle ended, General Saito wrote words that capture the Japanese mindset perfectly. "Whether we attack or whether we stay where we are, there is only death," he wrote. "However, in death there is life. We must utilize this opportunity to exalt true Japanese manhood. I will advance with those who remain to deliver another blow to the American devils." The Japanese spent the entire 6th of July preparing for what they called Gyokusai, that shattering like a jewel they believed would somehow matter. Every able-bodied soldier, every sailor, every marine who could still walk and carry a weapon was organized into assault units. The walking wounded, men who had been injured but could still move under their own power, were placed in follow-up waves. Civilian Japanese who were on the island, including women and teenagers, were given bamboo spears and told to follow behind the soldiers when the attack began. Those who were too wounded to walk were given grenades and told to wait for American troops to pass by their positions, then detonate those grenades and themselves. The Americans knew something was coming, could feel it in the way the Japanese had gone quiet. Intelligence officer Major James Cogswell had intercepted fragmentary Japanese communications that suggested some kind of final attack was being planned. More tellingly, the Japanese artillery had gone silent, suggesting they were saving what little ammunition they had left for a final barrage. Forward observers were reporting unusual movement in the Japanese lines after dark, shadows moving in ways that suggested concentration of forces. What the Japanese didn't know as they formed up in that darkness, what they couldn't have known because they had never developed the systems to understand how the Americans fought, was that they were walking into the most sophisticated killing system that had ever been devised by human beings. The American artillery on Saipan represented overwhelming firepower that had been organized with scientific precision. The artillery that was available to defend against any Japanese attack included 4 Marine artillery battalions equipped with 105mm howitzers, which meant 48 guns total. There were 2 Marine artillery battalions with 155mm howitzers, another 24 guns. 3 Army artillery battalions had their own 155mm howitzers, 36 more guns. 1 Army artillery battalion had 155mm guns, 12 more pieces. Dozens and dozens of 81mm mortars were organic to the infantry battalions, meaning each battalion had its own. Naval gunfire support came from 6 battleships and 8 cruisers that were sitting offshore. The total added up to over 150 artillery tubes, and that wasn't even counting the mortars and naval guns. These batteries were all connected by redundant communication systems that included primary radio nets, backup wire lines that had been strung, and emergency runners who could carry messages if everything else failed. Every infantry battalion had forward observers who had been trained specifically for this job. Every battery had surveyed its position to within inches of accuracy. Every gun had registered on pre-planned targets, meaning they had test-fired to make sure they knew exactly where their shells would land. The entire system could mass fire on a single target or engage multiple targets at the same time, whatever was needed. Colonel Louis Metzger, who was commanding the 10th Marine Artillery Regiment, had spent 3 full weeks perfecting his fire plan. His operations officer, Major Thomas Warnham, had divided the entire island into numbered squares on a master grid map. Each battery had pre-calculated firing data for every square in their sector, so when a forward observer called for fire on any particular grid, every battery already knew the range and deflection without having to calculate it from scratch. At exactly 0445 hours on the 7th of July in 1944, approximately 4,000 Japanese soldiers and armed civilians began moving forward into the darkness. The National World War II Museum's detailed account, which is based on official Marine Corps records that were filed after the battle, confirms this as the largest Banzai charge that happened anywhere in the Pacific War. The leading elements included what was left of the 136th Infantry Regiment from the 43rd Division, naval personnel from the destroyed Saipan Naval Base who had been turned into infantry, despite having no real training for it, and aviation mechanics who barely knew how to use the rifles they were carrying. The wounded hobbled forward on crutches, determined to die with what they considered honor. The Japanese moved through the Tanapag Plain Valley toward a 500-yard gap that existed between the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment, which was part of the 27th Infantry Division. As they advanced through the darkness, they began their battle cries, shouting Banzai over and over again, thousands of voices echoing off the valley walls and creating an otherworldly effect that chilled even Marines who had been through multiple battles before. Corporal Whelan, hidden in his observation post on a ridge that overlooked the valley, was already on his radio transmitting the information that needed to be transmitted. "Fire mission," he said into that radio. Grid 164-223. Enemy infantry in the open, estimated regiment strength moving south. Request immediate suppression. The response came back within seconds from the 10th Marines Fire Direction Center. "Roger," they said, Grid 164-223. Time on target, all available batteries. Splash in 90 seconds. What happened next was the product of 2 full years of American refinement in what they called the art of coordinated fires, though it was really more science than art by this point. Within the Fire Direction Center, a choreographed dance of calculation began playing out. The target grid was plotted on the master chart that showed the entire area. Distance and direction from each battery were measured with precision instruments that had been developed specifically for this purpose. Corrections for weather conditions were applied based on the latest meteorological data. Time on target missions, which everyone just called TOT missions, were the absolute pinnacle of artillery coordination, the most sophisticated thing the artillery could do. Instead of having batteries fire when they were ready, which created a rolling barrage that gave enemies time to take cover after the first shells landed, every battery calculated exactly when to fire so that all their shells would arrive at the target at exactly the same moment. Batteries that were farther away from the target fired first, batteries that were closer fired later, and the result was that dozens or even hundreds of shells would suddenly materialize out of the sky simultaneously, giving absolutely no warning that death was about to arrive. At exactly 0447, just 2 minutes after Whelan had called in his fire mission, the sky above the advancing Japanese forces erupted in fire and steel. The official Marine Corps history that was written after the war records that the initial barrage included shells from 12 artillery battalions, plus naval gunfire support from the ships offshore. The effect on the densely packed Japanese formation was absolutely catastrophic. Official records indicate that just the 105th Infantry's supporting artillery fired over 2,600 rounds in the first hour alone, and that was just part of the total fire that was being directed at the Japanese. The manually set time fuses, which required more skill to use than the proximity fuses that would come later in the war, proved devastatingly effective when crews had been properly trained in how to use them. Artillery crews had spent days and days perfecting their fuse-cutting techniques, some of them reducing the entire process to mere seconds per shell. The Japanese kept coming despite the devastating fire that was falling on them. This was the absolute essence of what they called Banzai, to continue despite impossible odds, to advance even when advancing meant certain death. The survivors picked their way through the bodies of their comrades who had already fallen, still screaming Banzai and Totsugeki, which meant charge, trying to maintain forward momentum despite everything. Corporal Whelan continued calling in adjustments based on what he was seeing through his field glasses. "Drop 200, left 100, he transmitted. Enemy infantry continuing advance. Request repeat. What distinguished American artillery in 1944 from all previous wars that had ever been fought was this ability to maintain continuous adjusted fire while enemy forces were actually moving. Forward observers didn't just call in a barrage and then hope for the best and wait to see what happened. They watched the fall of shot, where each volley was actually landing, called in corrections to adjust the fire, and walked the artillery fire through enemy formations like a man walking through a field. The fire direction centers had developed a system they called ladder fire, specifically for dealing with Banzai charges. As the Japanese advanced forward, the artillery would fire a line of shells across their front, creating a barrier, then systematically walk that barrage backward through their ranks, then forward again, then backward again, moving back and forth like a giant scythe cutting through wheat in a field. By 0530, after 45 minutes of continuous artillery fire, the main Japanese charge had managed to advance only 400 yards, and the cost had been absolutely devastating. Bodies carpeted the valley floor in layers. The wounded crawled over the dead, still trying to advance because that was what they had been ordered to do. Some groups took cover in ravines and defiles, trying to find any shelter from the steel that was raining down, only to have forward observers spot them and call in airbursts that turned those supposedly safe positions into death traps where there was no escape. As devastating as the artillery bombardment was, and it was more devastating than anything most of these men had ever imagined, some Japanese soldiers inevitably managed to push through the curtain of fire. By 0600, as the sun was starting to think about rising, scattered groups had actually reached the main American defense line. The 105th Infantry Regiment bore the absolute brunt of this assault. The two forward battalions would end up suffering 406 killed and 512 wounded, which worked out to nearly 80% casualties, according to National World War II museum records that were compiled later. This was where the American integration of direct and indirect fire support showed its full potential, its true capability. Every Marine rifle company had 60mm mortars that were organic to its weapons platoon, meaning they belonged to that platoon and could be used immediately. Every battalion had 81mm mortars. These weapons could engage targets that were too close for artillery, inside what they called the danger close range, where friendly fire became a serious risk. At 0615, the largest remaining group of Japanese soldiers, approximately 600 men who had somehow made it through everything that had been thrown at them, penetrated the American line and actually overran artillery positions belonging to the 3rd Battalion of the 10th Marines. The artillery crews, who were trained primarily to operate their guns rather than fight as infantry, removed the firing locks from their howitzers to prevent them from being used by the enemy, then fought as infantry with whatever weapons they could grab. Some batteries actually depressed their gun barrels to horizontal and fired point-blank into the charging Japanese at ranges of less than 50 yards, using beehive rounds that turned their howitzers into giant shotguns. When Japanese reserves were spotted forming up for what looked like it might be a second wave, the call went out for naval gunfire. Naval gunfire requested, someone transmitted, grid 159-215. Troops in the open. Official naval records that were filed after the battle show that USS Tennessee alone fired 293 rounds of 14-inch ammunition during the engagement, while USS Louisville contributed 322 rounds of 8-inch shells, and that was just 2 ships out of the many that were providing support. By 0730, after nearly 3 hours of continuous combat, the Banzai charge had degenerated into isolated groups of Japanese soldiers who were just trying to find any way through the American lines, any gap they could exploit. The carefully planned human wave attack, which had been organized and prepared for an entire day, had been completely shattered by coordinated firepower. Small groups of 5 to 20 soldiers would periodically emerge from whatever cover they had found, scream Banzai one more time, and charge the nearest American position they could see, only to be cut down by machine gun fire or rifles or grenades. The American artillery had shifted to what they called harassing and interdiction fire, Random barrages dropped on likely assembly areas and routes of movement to prevent the Japanese from reorganizing and mounting any kind of coordinated follow-up attack. Every few minutes, some valley or ravine would erupt in explosions as artillery systematically denied the enemy any patch of safe ground where they could regroup. The most tragic phase of this entire battle began around 0900, when the Japanese wounded who couldn't walk began their own desperate actions. According to multiple eyewitness accounts that were documented in official histories compiled after the war, men who had only one functional leg were hopping forward on crutches while holding grenades in their free hands. Soldiers with severe wounds were crawling toward American lines on their bellies, pushing rifles ahead of them because they couldn't carry them normally. The chaos and brutality of the Banzai Charge produced 3 Medal of Honor recipients whose actions are thoroughly documented in official citations that were approved and signed. Lieutenant Colonel William J. O'Brien, who was commanding the 1st Battalion of the 105th Infantry, refused evacuation despite being wounded multiple times. When Japanese forces actually overran his command post, he climbed up onto a jeep that had a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on it and directed fire against the enemy while completely exposed. After he had expended all the ammunition for the machine gun, he fought with 2 pistols until he was finally killed. His body was found after the battle surrounded by at least 30 dead Japanese soldiers who had fallen trying to take him down. His Medal of Honor citation, which was signed by President Truman on the 27th of May in 1945, details his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in the face of overwhelming odds. Private Thomas A. Baker, who was with Company A of the 105th Infantry, destroyed a Japanese strongpoint using a bazooka, then fought off multiple attacks over the course of hours, personally killing at least 24 enemy soldiers, according to witnesses. Severely wounded and unable to walk anymore, he refused evacuation when his comrades tried to carry him to safety. His famous last words to the men who were trying to help him were simply, "Get the hell away from me," because he knew they would die trying to save him. When his position was recaptured after the battle, Baker was found dead, propped up against a tree with an empty .45 caliber pistol still in his hand, and 8 dead Japanese soldiers scattered around him. His Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously on the 9th of May in 1945. Captain Benjamin L. Salomon, who was serving as the battalion surgeon for the 2nd Battalion of the 105th Infantry, was in the middle of treating wounded men when Japanese soldiers burst into his aid station. He killed 4 of them with his rifle, then ordered all the wounded evacuated while he stayed behind to cover their withdrawal with a machine gun. His body was found after the battle slumped over that machine gun with 98 dead Japanese soldiers lying in front of his position. He had suffered 76 bullet wounds and 24 bayonet wounds, but he had saved the wounded men he was supposed to protect. Due to questions about whether medical personnel were allowed to bear arms under the Geneva Convention, his Medal of Honor wasn't actually approved until the 1st of May in 2002, nearly 60 years after he died. As full daylight finally came to Saipan around 1000 hours, the full extent of the slaughter became visible to everyone. Official body count teams, which had the grim job of trying to count and identify the dead, would eventually document 4,311 Japanese dead from the charge itself. American casualties totaled approximately 1,000 killed and wounded combined, with the 105th Infantry Regiment essentially destroyed as a fighting unit and needing to be rebuilt from scratch. The mathematics of what had happened were absolutely stark and undeniable. The American artillery had fired approximately 12,000 rounds during the 15-hour battle that had just concluded. The fire direction centres had successfully coordinated fires from 18 separate artillery battalions, plus all that naval gunfire support. The system had functioned exactly as it had been designed to function, exactly as the training manuals said it should. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Walt, who had observed the aftermath while touring the battlefield, wrote in his official report words that captured the essential nature of what had occurred. "The enemy attacked with great courage, but without modern tactical sense," he wrote. "Our fire support system functioned exactly as designed. The forward observers performed magnificently. The fire direction centers never missed a beat. It was a cold assessment of a brutal battle, but it was accurate. As the sun climbed higher in the sky and the temperature began to rise toward the oppressive heat that characterized daytime on Saipan, American graves registration teams began the grim work of collecting bodies and trying to restore some order to the battlefield. The scale of death was unprecedented in anything the Pacific War had seen up to that point. Major Edward McCarthy, who was commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 105th Infantry and had been one of the units that bore the full brunt of the attack, described it in his after-action report as looking like a cattle stampede from a Western movie, except the Japanese just kept on coming wave after wave. Among the American lines, the psychological impact of what they had just witnessed was profound and lasting. Many Marines and soldiers had witnessed death before, had seen men killed in combat, and had killed enemy soldiers themselves, but nothing on this scale had ever been part of their experience. The systematic destruction of thousands of human beings, no matter how militarily necessary it had been, no matter how much those human beings had been trying to kill them, left deep impressions that would last for the rest of their lives. Captain Edmund G. Love, who was the 27th Division historian and would later write extensively about the battle and its impact, interviewed survivors immediately after the action while their memories were still fresh. His notes, which are preserved in the National Archives to this day, capture the raw emotions that the men were feeling. Men who had been through everything were shaken, he wrote, not by fear, because the Japanese never really had a chance once the artillery opened up, but by the sheer scale of the killing. The Japanese survivors, what few there were, melted back into caves in the northern part of Saipan where they could hide. Among those survivors was Captain Sakai Oba, who would end up leading guerrilla resistance for another 16 months before he finally surrendered in December of 1945, which was 3 months after Japan's official capitulation had ended the war. His survival and his continued resistance are thoroughly documented in military records and in a book called Oba, The Last Samurai, Saipan, 1944–45. General Saito, who had ordered the charge that cost so many lives, committed seppuku on the 10th of July in 1944, 3 days after the failed assault. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had been the former commander of the Pearl Harbor attack force and was now trapped on Saipan, had already taken his own life on the 6th of July, the day before the charge even began. Their deaths marked the end of organized Japanese resistance on the island, though individual holdouts would continue fighting for months and even years. The Battle of Saipan's Banzai Charge showcased revolutionary developments in both military technology and doctrine that would influence how wars were fought for decades to come. The Fire Direction Center system, which had been developed at Fort Sill back in the 1930s, had transformed artillery from something that was more art than science into a precise and predictable science. Instead of having individual battery commanders making gut decisions based on their experience and intuition, you now had trained specialists using mathematical procedures to optimize every single aspect of fire support. The system included graphical firing tables that eliminated the need for complex calculations that would have taken forever to work out, standard radio procedures that minimized the amount of communication time needed, and pre-surveyed battery positions that were accurate to within 1 meter. Meteorological sections provided hourly weather updates that affected where shells would land, while registration procedures accounted for things like barrel wear and ammunition variations that could throw off accuracy. Time-on-target missions, which were essentially a uniquely American capability at that point in time, demonstrated the absolute pinnacle of this coordination. Multiple batteries firing from different positions would calculate backward from a desired impact time, with guns firing in sequence so that all the shells from all the different batteries arrived at the target simultaneously. This technique, which was essentially impossible without precise communication and calculation, multiplied both the psychological and physical impact of artillery fire beyond anything that had been possible before. Japanese military leadership had received warnings about American artillery capabilities over the course of the war, but they had chosen to ignore those warnings. Japanese officers who had been sent to observe German Wehrmacht operations in Europe had filed reports about American fire support doctrine and how effective it was. Military attachés stationed in neutral countries had forwarded reports about American industrial production of artillery ammunition, which was running into millions of rounds being produced per month. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, who was the operations officer for the Japanese 32nd Army on Okinawa, had studied American tactics extensively and had warned repeatedly against launching banzai charges. In pre-war planning sessions, he had argued strenuously that massed infantry attacks against modern firepower were essentially suicidal and would accomplish nothing except the death of good soldiers. He was overruled by generals who believed that spiritual power, that unique Japanese spirit they called Yamato Damashi, could overcome any material disadvantage. The banzai charges revealed fatal flaws in Japanese racial ideology that had been embedded in their military culture. The belief that Americans were soft, materialistic, and incapable of sustained combat had been drummed into every Japanese soldier from the moment they entered training. They were told over and over that Americans would break and run when faced with determined Japanese warriors who were exhibiting that Yamato Damashi spirit, that uniquely Japanese willingness to die for the emperor. This racism cut both ways, though. American forces, who had initially been terrified by banzai charges in the early battles of the war when they didn't understand what was happening, had by 1944 come to see these charges as evidence of Japanese irrationality. The charges reinforced American stereotypes about the Japanese that would influence strategic decisions for the rest of the war, including the ultimate decision to use atomic weapons a year later. The American response to banzai charges, which was always overwhelming firepower rather than countercharges or close combat, reflected both tactical wisdom and cultural differences in how the two nations approached warfare. Americans approached war as a problem to be solved through technology and organization and systematic application of resources. Japanese approached it as a test of spiritual strength and individual warrior spirit. When these two philosophies collided on battlefields across the Pacific, technology won every single time without exception. The Saipan Banzai charge represented the culmination of 2 full years of American learning and adaptation to Japanese tactics. In early 1942, American forces had been caught completely off guard by Japanese tactics that they didn't understand. By mid-1944, they had developed specific counter-doctrines that turned Japanese strengths into weaknesses, that made the things the Japanese were good at work against them. The evolution of American thinking was documented in after-action reports that were filed after every major battle. After Guadalcanal in August of 1942, reports noted that enemy night attacks achieved initial success through surprise and aggression and recommended improved night defensive procedures. After New Georgia in July of 1943, reports noted that coordinated defensive fires broke up most enemy charges and that units with registered artillery support suffered minimal casualties. After Tarawa in November of 1943, reports noted that time-on-target missions proved highly effective against massed enemy troops and recommended that all forward observers be trained in TOT procedures. After Saipan in July of 1944, the report simply stated that the enemy banzai attack was completely destroyed by coordinated fires, and that no changes to doctrine were recommended. American troops, who had initially been genuinely unnerved by the sight and sound of screaming Japanese soldiers charging with bayonets fixed, had learned over the course of 2 years to see these attacks as opportunities for destruction rather than as threats to be feared. The decision by General Saito to launch the banzai charge on Saipan represented a catastrophic failure of Japanese military leadership at multiple levels. Saito himself knew the attack would fail, his final messages make that clear. But he ordered it anyway because the alternative, surrender, was unthinkable in the context of Japanese military culture. The American artillery system that destroyed the Saipan Banzai charge so completely incorporated multiple technological innovations that had been developed over the previous few years. Radio communications using the SCR-300 and SCR-610 FM radios that forward observers carried provided clear, static-free communications even in the electromagnetic chaos that characterized modern battlefields. With a range of 3 to 5 miles, these radios allowed observers to communicate with multiple fire direction centers simultaneously, calling for fire from different units as needed. Survey equipment that American artillery units used was the very latest available, allowing them to establish battery positions with unprecedented accuracy. Battery positions were tied into a common grid system that meant any observer anywhere could call for fire from any battery without having to do complex calculations to convert between different coordinate systems. Meteorological support was provided by dedicated sections within each artillery regiment that released weather balloons every 6 hours to measure wind speed and direction at various altitudes. This data was absolutely crucial for long-range fire, where wind could push shells significantly off target. Fire control instruments like the M7 graphical firing table and the M10 plotting board allowed fire direction centers to track multiple targets and multiple friendly units simultaneously, solving complex firing problems in seconds rather than the minutes it would have taken using traditional methods. The destruction of the Saipan Banzai charge had strategic implications that went far beyond the island itself. When word reached Tokyo that over 4,000 soldiers had died in a single charge while inflicting minimal American casualties, it contributed significantly to the fall of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government on the 18th of July in 1944, just 11 days after the battle. The fall of Saipan as a whole brought American B-29 bombers to within 1,250 miles of Tokyo itself. By November of 1944, just 4 months later, bombers were launching from Saipan's rebuilt airfields to strike the Japanese homeland directly. Admiral Osami Nagano would later state bluntly that their war was lost with the loss of Saipan, that everything after that was just delaying the inevitable. Despite the obvious futility that had been demonstrated at Saipan in such brutal fashion, Japanese forces would continue to launch more Banzai charges at Guam, at Tinian, at Peleliu, at Iwo Jima, and at Okinawa, with each charge ending in similar slaughter. The institutional refusal to adapt to reality would end up costing hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. 9 months after Saipan, at Okinawa in May of 1945, the final evolution of American counter-Banzai tactics was put on full display. When the Japanese 32nd Army launched desperate charges on the 4th of May, the results were even more devastating than what had happened at Saipan. The May 4th counter-offensive saw approximately 5,000 Japanese soldiers attack American lines in what they hoped would be a breakthrough. Within 6 hours of fighting, 4,500 of them were dead. The Americans suffered 335 casualties. The kill ratio of nearly 15-1 demonstrated the absolute dominance that coordinated firepower had achieved over human wave attacks. By the time of Okinawa, the Americans had added new elements to their system, including improved white phosphorus shells that were used for marking targets and for psychological effect, better integration between Marine and Army artillery units that had sometimes had communication problems in earlier battles, and continuous wave radar that could track enemy movement at night when visual observation was impossible. The efficiency of American artillery in destroying Banzai charges raised profound questions about the nature of modern warfare that troubled many of the participants. The industrial slaughter of brave but misguided soldiers, while militarily necessary and completely justified, troubled many American participants who had to witness it and be part of it. Lieutenant Colonel Justice Chambers, whose battalion helped repel the charge at Saipan, wrote in his personal papers that were discovered years later, "There is no glory in what we did. We killed thousands of brave men who never had a chance. Yes, they were trying to kill us. Yes, it was necessary. But turning artillery into an assembly line of death is not war as our fathers knew it. The completely one-sided nature of the killing, which had been made possible by American technological and organizational superiority, represented a new kind of warfare where individual courage and willingness to sacrifice meant absolutely nothing when confronted with coordinated firepower. The artillery techniques that had been perfected against Japanese banzai charges would go on to influence military doctrine for decades after the war ended. The fire direction center concept became absolutely standard in all modern armies around the world. Time-on-target missions became routine training for artillery units. The integration of forward observers with infantry units became established doctrine that no one questioned. In Korea, just 5 years later, American forces would use identical techniques to destroy Chinese human wave attacks that used similar tactics to the Japanese. At the Battle of Chip-Yong-ni in 1951, American artillery destroyed an entire Chinese division that was attempting a night assault using human wave tactics. The Chinese, just like the Japanese before them, learned the hard way that courage and willingness to die could not overcome coordinated firepower backed by industrial production. The Vietnam War saw further refinement of these same basic concepts, with computers being introduced for fire control calculations and helicopter-borne forward observers providing unprecedented observation capabilities. The Gulf War in 1991 showcased GPS-guided artillery shells that could hit within meters of their intended target. But the basic concept, massed coordinated fires directed by forward observers and controlled by fire direction centers, remained essentially unchanged from what had been developed and perfected at Saipan. Decades after the battle had ended and most of the participants had grown old, American veterans of Saipan would gather to reflect on their experience. At the 50th anniversary commemoration that was held in 1994, survivors gathered together to remember that terrible morning in July of 1944. Arthur Robinson, who had been a private with the 105th Infantry and who had somehow survived the charge when so many of his friends had died, recalled in an interview, "You have to understand, we didn't want to kill them all, but they kept coming at us, wave after wave. Our artillery just cut them down like wheat. It was horrible to watch, but what choice did we have?" The efficiency of the killing, the systematic and mechanical nature of it, haunted many of the participants for the rest of their lives. They had won not through superior courage or superior fighting skill in individual combat, but through superior systems and superior firepower. It was victory without the glory that soldiers are supposed to feel, success without the satisfaction that should come with it. The destruction of the Japanese banzai charge on Saipan represented the collision between two completely different military philosophies that could not have been more opposed to each other. The Japanese believed with absolute conviction that spiritual strength and willingness to die could overcome any material disadvantage, that the superiority of the Japanese spirit would eventually prevail over American material advantages. The Americans believed just as strongly that firepower and technology and systematic organization would always defeat human wave attacks, no matter how brave the attackers might be. The outcome was never really in doubt once these two philosophies collided on the battlefield. The American artillery system, with its forward observers and fire direction centers and time-on-target missions and integrated communications, represented the application of industrial management techniques to the business of warfare. The Japanese banzai charge, which was rooted in samurai tradition and Shinto beliefs about honorable death and the importance of dying well, belonged to an earlier era of warfare. Against American artillery as it existed in 1944, the banzai charge was nothing more than mass suicide that had been disguised as military tactics. The Saipan banzai charge taught crucial lessons to everyone involved, but only one side survived in sufficient numbers to apply those lessons in future battles. For the Americans, it validated completely their massive investment in artillery systems and fire control technology. The ability to mass fires from multiple batteries on a single target within seconds of a call for fire had proven absolutely decisive. For Japan, the lesson came far too late to make any difference. Some Japanese officers did manage to learn from the disaster and adapt their tactics. On Iwo Jima and later at Okinawa, generals like Tadamichi Kuribayashi and Mitsuru Ushijima deliberately avoided large-scale banzai charges, instead fighting defensive battles from fortified positions that maximized American casualties and prolonged the fighting. But these commanders were exceptions to the rule. The institutional Japanese military never formally abandoned the banzai charge as a tactic, never officially declared that it didn't work anymore. Captain Sakai Oba, who survived the Saipan charge by avoiding the main attack and conducting guerrilla operations from the caves for 16 months afterward, would later reflect in interviews conducted years after the war. "We learned that night that courage without technology is meaningless in modern war. The Americans didn't defeat our spirit, they didn't break our will to fight. They simply made it irrelevant with their systems and their firepower." The final accounting of the Saipan Banzai charge reveals the stark mathematics of what happens when industrial warfare meets traditional warrior culture. Japanese casualties included 4,311 confirmed killed in action, according to official body counts conducted after the battle. Wounded numbers are unknown because most of the wounded died subsequently, either from their injuries or in continued fighting. Total participants in the charge were approximately 4,000 to 4,300 men. The casualty rate for the Japanese worked out to nearly 100% when you account for those who died immediately and those who died later. American casualties were concentrated in specific units. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry suffered 406 killed and 512 wounded. The 3rd Battalion of the 10th Marines took 127 casualties of various types. Total American casualties for the entire battle came to approximately 1,000 men killed and wounded. The casualty rate for the American units that were actually engaged was around 40%, which was devastating, but the overall rate when you include units that weren't directly engaged was much lower. The ammunition that was expended during the battle tells its own story about the nature of industrial warfare. American forces fired an estimated 12,000 plus artillery rounds of all types. Thousands of mortar rounds were fired, but weren't counted separately in many reports. Naval gunfire contributed 615 major caliber shells that were documented in ship logs. The cost-effectiveness worked out to approximately 3 artillery shells per Japanese casualty when you do the math, which from a cold military logistics standpoint represents efficient use of resources. These numbers tell a story about industrial efficiency being applied to the business of human destruction. The Americans had turned warfare into an equation where firepower multiplied by coordination equaled victory, and the Japanese had no answer to that equation. The Saipan Banzai charge raises questions that remain relevant to modern warfare even 80 years later. Is there still a place for individual human courage in industrialized combat where machines do most of the killing? Can technology completely negate the human element in war, or will there always be a need for soldiers on the ground? Does the efficiency of modern killing somehow diminish the humanity of those who conduct it, even when it's absolutely necessary? Modern American military doctrine, which evolved directly from the lessons learned in the Pacific War, emphasizes coordinated combined arms operations with overwhelming firepower as the default response to any threat. Technology and organization and systematic application of resources are prioritized above everything else. The human element remains important, of course, you still need soldiers on the ground, but it's subordinate to technological and organizational superiority. The Japanese soldiers who charged into American artillery fire on the 7th of July in 1944 were among the very last warriors in human history to believe that spiritual strength alone could overcome material disadvantage. Their deaths proved conclusively that in modern warfare as it exists today, courage without technology is simply not enough to achieve victory. The American artillery system that destroyed them so efficiently represented the future of warfare, coordinated and calculated and crushingly efficient in ways that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. The 4,311 Japanese soldiers who died in the charge showed extraordinary courage that cannot be denied or diminished. They advanced into fire that they knew would kill them, continued moving forward when every rational calculation said they should stop, and died trying to achieve an impossible objective. They deserved better leadership than they got, better than commanders who sent them to die in a manner that achieved absolutely nothing except to demonstrate how obsolete their tactics had become. But their commanders, who were blinded by ideology and tradition and an unwillingness to accept that the world had changed, sent them to their deaths anyway. Their sacrifice stands today as an eternal warning about what happens when courage meets modern firepower. In warfare as it exists in the modern world, courage alone is not enough and never will be again. Technology and organization and firepower will always defeat human waves, no matter how brave those humans might be, no matter how willing they are to die. The age of the glorious cavalry charge and the heroic infantry assault ended on that valley floor on Saipan, killed by American artillery that turned warfare into mathematics and mathematics into mass death. The Banzai charge itself was obliterated by American artillery coordination, but more importantly than that, the very idea of the Banzai charge was obliterated as well, revealed as nothing more than a romantic anachronism in an age where warfare had become industrialized. In that valley of death on Saipan, in the early morning darkness of July 7, 1944, courage met coordination, spirit met system, and tradition collided head-on with technology. Technology won that morning, and technology always wins because that's the nature of modern warfare, and there's no changing it.